Imagine just taking one trip in your lifetime that could change the world we live in today. Henry Kissinger did it. His secret visit to China in 1971 literally changed the course of history. It paved the way for Nixon's historic trip a year later. That ultimately led to the normalization of relations between the two nations. Today, Kissinger is widely credited with shaping the modern China-U.S. relationship. I'm Mike Walter. Let's take it full frame.
Opening up to China.
This was a big gamble for Nixon. He couldn't be sure it was going to work given the years of hostility. And the Chinese wanted to have someone come to China secretly first to see whether it was in both countries' advantage for Nixon to actually go and have a summit.
周恩来总理在会见美国乒乓球代表团的时候说你们的来访打开了中美两国人民友好往来的大门，这个就后来称为乒乓外交。
A seat at the table with an open mind.
He always said that you need to understand the culture of the country you were dealing with. You needed to know more about their positions than they did.
Premier Zhou Enlai came up with a Chinese version, in which was the basic framework of the final communique. The framework was that each side would first mention their own positions, which were very vastly different, and then go on to say what they had in common.
Continued influence in global diplomacy.
The Chinese like to talk about in negotiations going for a win-win situation. This was clearly a win-win situation. Both sides achieved their major goals.
He became very aware that economic issues had a strategic role in the world and were strategically related to some of the other things he was trying to do. So I learned from that he had a very open mind.
Remembering Kissinger. Next.
Henry Kissinger became a central figure in U.S. foreign policy, first as National Security Advisor and later as Secretary of State. His tenure was marked by secret negotiations, back-channel diplomacy, and a pragmatic approach to global affairs. My next guest was at his side, watching as history was being made. Here's my conversation with Winston Lord. I met Lord in New York City. Let's start with the scene setter, this secret trip, which of course led to the Nixon meeting with Mao. Kind of give us the background, how it all came together and the significance of it.
Nixon and Kissinger each came into office in 1969 wanting to open relations with China. Nixon had previewed this in a magazine article, and he wanted to bring China into the world system so there'd be more stability. On February 1 week after his inauguration, Nixon sent a memo to Kissinger saying, I want to get in touch with the Chinese. Shows you his priority. They faced two major obstacles. Obviously, we've been fighting each other in Korea with 22 years of mutual isolation and hostility. And we had absolutely no contact. So how are we going to even talk to each other to try to move ahead? We had to set up secret channels. We finally did this through the Pakistanis. And we had to prepare our publics and the world for the fact that we were moving in a different direction with regard to China. So we took some modest unilateral steps to show that we were willing to relax economic restrictions and try to move ahead. So that all led to the backdrop of setting up a secret trip to China. This was a big gamble for Nixon. He couldn't be sure it was going to work given the years of hostility. And so he wanted to, and the Chinese wanted to have someone come to China secretly first to see whether it was in both countries' advantage for Nixon to actually go and have a summit. So that's the background. And for me, it was particularly dramatic. My wife was born in Shanghai, so I was going back to her native land. We were, of course, about to set off a geopolitical earthquake and change the world system. Kissinger was about to meet with Zhou Enlai and other Chinese leaders. And so it was an extremely dramatic and nerve-wracking expedition. But the highlight of the trip for me was the fact that I ended up being the first American official into China after 22 years. We'd cut off relations in 1949 when the communists took over. So in his Pakistani plane with all the Pakistanis in the front, Kissinger was in the back. But as we got close to the Chinese border, I went to the front of the plane so that we go into China. I was ahead of Kissinger in the back of the plane and the first American into China.
Winston Lord was the director of policy planning at the United States Department of State and ambassador to China from 1985 to 1989. Let me ask about the pressure associated with this, because there's so much riding on this secret meeting, which eventually led to just an extraordinary chapter in history, both for China and the United States. Talk to me about the pressure of actually trying to come away with something tangible.
You know, people in retrospect seem to say, well, the opening of China was sort of inevitable, would have happened. They forget it took a great deal of political courage by Nixon to authorize this. And I must say it was a big leap for the Chinese, although they had a much more controlled political system. So both sides were making a gamble. And so when we went to China with Kissinger in July 71, we had two objectives: to discuss a whole variety of international issues, Taiwan, Russia, Vietnam, the Middle East, Japan, and so on, and make sure there was enough common interests that we, despite our differences, could move ahead in our relationship. But secondly, we had to come up with a joint announcement of the meeting, which would serve the political purposes of both sides. So the Chinese wanted to make it look like Nixon was so anxious to come to China, they were doing him a favor and letting him come. We wanted to make it clear that the Chinese were so anxious to have Nixon that he was doing them a favor by coming. We met in between to make clear it was on both sides' interests. So as a result of the trip and the announcement, a few days after we left Pakistan, we set up the framework for Nixon to go to China in February 1972.
Talk to me about the significance of that meeting.
The Nixon-Mao meeting was one of the most important meetings in international affairs in the last 75 years, in my opinion. I'm a little biased because I was there secretly. The fact that they met signaled to the world that a new era was opening up. Not that we're going to become instant friends, but that we had enough in common, primarily balancing the Soviet Union, but for other reasons, that we could move ahead. Each side had prepared its public and the world for this change, the secret trip announcement, other steps we took. Mao had invited an American ping pong team to China a few months earlier, and that was a symbol of a new era. So it was set up that way. But still, it was important that the talks themselves established the right framework for the new relationship. Mao asked to see Nixon as soon as he arrived in Beijing, which is very unusual. Usually you wait till the last day and he puts his stamp of approval on a visit. By seeing him so quickly, he was indicating to his people and his cadre and to the world that he approved this visit from the very beginning. So just the early nature of the visit during the trip and then sitting down to each other. And so it really served its purpose, and it was one of the most dramatic meetings, as I say, in recent world history.
Henry Kissinger used covert diplomatic channels to engage with Chinese leaders, particularly Premier Zhou Enlai, bypassing traditional diplomatic routes. I think about being in my 30s and being there, witnessing history. I mean, it's such a heady time for you. Does the gravity of it all kind of hit you, or you're just thinking we're doing our work and hopefully it'll set the stage? Or do you recognize this is going to change the course of history?
No, it's the latter. We recognize the geopolitical significance. And as a result of that trip, both sides achieved their objectives. For the Chinese, they figured by opening with us, other countries would follow suit and move toward China. And they did, Japan and Europe and so on. And they got into the United Nations. So they broke out of the diplomatic isolation. And if they needed some movement on Taiwan, they made major concessions in terms of waiting on Taiwan, more than we did. But we made some gestures in the communique, so they got something on Taiwan. So from their standpoint, the meeting was a success. But from our standpoint, it was equally a success. We made major progress in arms control, on agreement with respect to Berlin, and then we had our own summit with the Soviets. Within a couple of months, this was all achieved. This dramatic opening with a quarter of the world's people put some of this in perspective and lifted their spirits. There's greater stability in Asia. So the Chinese like to talk about, in negotiations, going for a win-win situation. This was clearly a win-win situation. Both sides achieved their major goals.
Henry Kissinger was instrumental in negotiating the Shanghai Communique, which established the foundation of China-U.S. relations, including the One China policy. The Shanghai Communique, leading up to that, how instrumental was Kissinger in getting that, done?
Well, of course, Kissinger was absolutely crucial. And I know this firsthand because I helped Kissinger draft almost all these memos and took the notes at these trips. So when we went to China in October 71, this was after the secret trip, we went publicly to set up the logistics for the summit, like the itinerary and media arrangements and so on. We started to negotiate what became the Shanghai Communique. Each side has to state its positions, even and especially when they oppose each other, whether it's philosophic or specific issues. And that communique was very skillful, and I give the Chinese credit for this unusual approach. There's never been a communique like that. And even today, 50 years later, people are still referring to it. Most diplomatic communiques sink without a trace within days.
What's it like, though, to be around such superior intellects? As a young man watching these, amazing intellects and the back and forth, what was that like?
Well, I was extremely privileged. And as I said, as special assistant, I got to be part of all the key negotiations. I was the one person that Kissinger would pair with experts on an issue so that he could have someone else have a global perspective how all the pieces fit together. So I was not only involved with China, but I spent even more time in the secret negotiations with the Vietnamese, was on the Middle East shuttles, and the meetings with the Soviets, including a summit in May 1972. So I was really privileged not only to learn from Kissinger, but also to learn observing other major leaders. And I'd have to say, I agree with Kissinger that Zhou Enlai was the single most impressive. The test of pure brilliance of exchanges, those between Kissinger and Zhou Enlai were absolutely amazing. And I was privileged to be in every one for hundreds of hours, as well as 5 meetings with Mao and all the meetings with Deng Xiaoping. So yeah, this was dramatic and it helped to shape my own strategic thinking. I will say it was very demanding, not only the hours, but Kissinger's pursuit of excellence. So I was sort of quitting about once a week, given the hours and the fact he almost never praised you. He would just ask for better work. I will say one thing, he didn't like yes men or yes women. I was first hired by him and I was sitting across from the West Wing in another part of the White House and wrote some memos criticizing some or asking questions about some of his policies. And he hired me because of those memos, not despite them, as his special assistant. But he stretched my patience, he stretched my nerves, but he also stretched my capabilities and my horizons. So I'll be forever grateful.
Tracing his trajectory over all those years and his relationship with China, how did he evolve? And he was always kind of that treasure. It didn't matter who was in the White House. They wanted to pick his brain after he got back from China.
As remarkable as Kissinger's government career was, equally remarkable is what he did after his career was over. He was in government 8 years. Most cabinet officials have no influence or no impact as soon as they leave office. His continuing impact and influence for 50 years after leaving office was absolutely amazing, not to mention what he could do as he got older. And so he always was at the call of presidents of both parties. He would make sure they called him. He didn't try to angle to get in there. He was always careful publicly. He would write tough issues and even disagree with ongoing policies, but he did it in a very respectful manner and never personally attacked the incumbent president, even if he disagreed. He would give his views in private. And if he disagreed with issues, he felt an obligation to speak out. But it was always in sort of a supportive, nonpartisan way. Sometimes some of us would get annoyed because we thought he should have been tougher on whatever president it was. Also, foreign leaders always wanted to see him. Whenever they came to the U.S., they would meet with him. He would travel all the time talking to foreign leaders. He went to China, I would say, 100 times. I mean, that's just unbelievable. Meanwhile, he was running a business, consulting around the world. He was writing books, giving interviews. It was just amazing performance.
Was there a moment where Kissinger ever went, ay, 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 or just moments where he kind of let down his guard as a diplomat and kind of shared with you, thoughts like that?
Well, many times Kissinger and I was very fortunate to be with him a lot, all the time, would share either embarrassments or actual angst over setbacks. The most famous one was when we went to Saigon to talk to the South Vietnamese government about the breakthrough we just made in negotiations with the North Vietnamese. And we thought that President Thieu, since we're keeping him in power and we fought off the North Vietnamese demands to get rid of him, and we refused to do that, we thought he would be satisfied with the outcome of the negotiations. And he just ripped us apart. And this was in October 1972. And so we shared tremendous depression and angst, and including the coming months when we went back to negotiate with North Vietnamese. We finally made progress and had a deal, but for a while it was very depressing. So yeah, we had great moments of depression as well as exhilaration.
Yeah, well, what a storied career. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Welcome back. Deng Xiaoping's reforms and Kissinger's diplomatic efforts were the perfect recipe for success. It helped create an environment in which China could pursue economic modernization and open its economy to the West.
The announcement I shall now read is being issued simultaneously in Peking and in the United States. Premier Zhou Enlai and Dr. Henry Kissinger, President Nixon's assistant for national security affairs, held talks in Peking from July 9 to 11, 1971. Knowing of President Nixon's expressed desire to visit the People's Republic of China, Premier Zhou Enlai, on behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China, has extended an invitation to President Nixon to visit China at an appropriate date before May 1972. President Nixon has accepted the invitation with pleasure.
In July 1971, President Nixon's then National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger, made a secret trip to Beijing. It paved the way for President Nixon's historic visit the following year and marked the beginning of normalized relations between the two nations.
When we arrived in China, it was one of the most important occasions of our lives.
We had, at the time, a common adversary in the Soviet Union. The United States wanted to leverage an opening to China of some sort, not knowing where it would head, quite frankly. President Nixon, who really thought strategically about global affairs did believe that China had to be brought into the world of nations again and not be isolated. It was too important a power, too large of a power. It had too much potential simply to be isolated and angry, as one way that President Nixon described.
Years earlier, the groundwork was already being laid for the historic visits. In 1970, Mao Zedong invited American journalist Edgar Snow to stand with him at Tiananmen Square. A picture of them was published in the People's Daily. It was a message that Nixon was welcome in Beijing. In April 1971, the American table tennis team, which was competing in the World Championships in Japan, was invited to China.
周恩来总理在会见美国乒乓球代表团的时候说你们的来访打开了中美两国人民友好往来的大门，这个就后来称为乒乓外交。
Kissinger's trip was a few months later, in July of 1971. While in Pakistan, Kissinger pretended to fall ill, and he left early from a state dinner. This was his cover to secretly board a plane to China. In Beijing, Kissinger met with Premier Zhou Enlai. When it came to Taiwan, the U.S. recognition of a one-China policy was crucial for the talks to move forward. These meetings laid the framework for what would become the Shanghai Communique, signed during Nixon's trip in 1972.
上海公报对最大的好处，也就讲我们是美方说明台湾海峡两边所有的中国人都认为只有一个中国，台湾是中国的一部分。
I recall that at the beginning, the American side, Dr. Kissinger, provided their draft, which was basically a hazy idea of what both sides agreed to, and it avoided some important issues like the Taiwan issue. So Premier Zhou Enlai came up with a Chinese version, in which was the basic framework of the final communique. The framework was that each side would first mention their own positions, which were very vastly different, and then go on to say what they had in common.
Well, the Nixon trip was symbolically so important because Nixon was historically quite a big critic of China and communism, and it showed pragmatism could work.
Nixon's visit gives a boost of legitimacy to the People's Republic, leading to a wide range of fast diplomatic recognitions of the PRC as the legitimate government of China in a way that the Americans had opposed up until that time.
1971年10月份，基辛格中期访问离开北京的那一天，联合国以绝对多数的票数恢复了中国在联合国的合法地位。这个就说明啊，世界各国绝大多数国家都欢迎中美改善关系，欢迎美国采取积极的步骤。
The importance of the relationship between our two countries remains crucial, and as in fact it's more important even than in 1971.
On February 21st, 1972, after months of secret negotiations, President Nixon arrived in Beijing.
Dr. Kissinger's secret mission to China was basically to establish that there would be a presidential visit to China. So President Nixon's visit was the real highlight.
The first handshake was between President Nixon and Premier Zhou Enlai on the tarmac. The main purpose of the trip was to open a relationship with China, and just by reaching across to shake each other's hands, we symbolized the beginning of that process.
Almost immediately after landing, Nixon met face-to-face with Mao Zedong.
It was thought that this interview might just last for, say, 15 minutes, but actually it went on for 70 minutes, because I think they both had much to say to each other. It was an opportunity for the highest leaders of both countries to meet face to face and directly exchange views on how they saw the international scene and the relations between the two countries. It was a personal contact, and that, I think, set the stage for the development of future relations.
Communist to the core, vice premier and the real power in the new China so long ignored, being greeted by an American president and his wife and called friend.
Months prior to his 1979 trip to the U.S., Deng Xiaoping had announced China's new reform and opening up policy. China would now welcome foreign trade and investment. Kissinger's 1971 trip to China signaled the beginnings of normalized relations, and Deng's visit fully realized those diplomatic ties.
I would like to read a joint communique which is being simultaneously issued in Peking at this very moment by the leaders of the People's Republic of China. A joint communique on the establishment of diplomatic relations between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China, January 1st, 1979.
太平洋地区两岸的两个重要国家发展友好合作关系，对于促进太平洋地区和世界的和平，无疑将是一个重要的因素。
It was the first time that Chinese people had seen a lot of America on their television. There was very little on America on Chinese TV until Deng Xiaoping went to America. So that was really an eye-opening experience for both the US and China. I think the US and China was on a very strong path from 79 right through the 80s. And you could see it by the numbers of visitations, the investment began to soar, the exchanges between the US and China.
President Nixon at the time was asked about its significance. He said it was the week that changed the world. People thought that was trite, that was banal, that was not significant. Turned out he was quite right. That trip was the catalyst for many of those changes. That trip opened the door for China to the world and enabled China to begin to play the important role that it now plays in global governance and global affairs.
After leaving government, Henry Kissinger still continued to be an influential China advisor for decades to come. He maintained a strong relationship with Chinese leaders and continued to influence U.S. policy towards China. My next guest worked closely with Kissinger back in the Nixon administration and then continued on as a close collaborator up until his death. Here's my conversation with Robert Hormats. I met Hormats in New York City. You have such a storied, lengthy relationship with Dr. Kissinger. You've known him I interviewed you right after his death, and you were rather wistful about it. The loss was tangible. To see him and to see how he operates. How much do you think was kind of formed in his childhood in terms of his diplomatic style?
Well, that's a good question. I worked with him from the time I was 24. He gave me my first job. He was by far my most important mentor in life, all the way through from the time I started. He said, at one point, he says, I have a lot more confidence in you than you have in yourself. He said, you can do these things, even though I was just a grad student at the time. He gave me a lot of things to do in terms of preparing documents and things for the president's trip and for subsequent trips on the economic side of the equation. And we became very good friends. We talked quite regularly on the phone. He, in fact, talked to me just before he left for his last trip to China, where he focused a great deal on AI. And when he was invited, he said to the Chinese, I will go. He's 100 years old, mind you. He says, I want to go. He saw the relationship deteriorating, so he wanted to go and see what he could do to stabilize it. That was his main goal. But he also said that I want to be sure that we don't just discuss geostrategic and geopolitical issues. I want to be sure that we give equal time to AI. So he actually discussed AI quite a bit with Xi Jinping. It was sort of Kissinger's diplomatic thinking evolved. He was always ahead of the curve. And that's what I found in working for him. In the beginning, he didn't have much interest in economic issues. And then, of course, there was China, where in the beginning we had no economic ties whatsoever, no trade, no investment relations at all. So he said, why don't you write up a little something on what we can do, a few little things we can do that will build confidence. So I did that. And we did a couple of things on our own, but the Chinese didn't reciprocate. And then we learned that it was sort of a bureaucratic thing in China. How do you deal with the Americans on economic issues? But Mao told him, well, we actually want to do a few little things. We want to do this. So when you add up the oil crisis and the dollar issue at Camp David, which caused a lot of fury among the Allies because they weren't told in advance, and then the China relationship, he became very aware that economic issues had a strategic role in the world and were strategically related to some of the other things he was trying to do. So I learned from that he had a very open mind. He had a very fertile mind. How he could link all these things together. For someone with very little experience in them, he became a master of these, and learned a lot about them and became actually quite interested in them. And whatever he did, he took a lot of interest in. He didn't just do things peripherally. He did them in a very centered and focused way.
Robert Hormats served as Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth and now is Vice Chairman of Kissinger's Associates. Just from a historical standpoint, even when you look back on it now, it was dramatic, and it changed the course of history, not just for the United States, but China and that relationship.
Absolutely. Well, the trip was interesting in a number of senses. From my personal point of view, being involved to a degree, it was still a surprise, because prior to the trip, he went around the table of his staff and asked if anyone knew anything about China. And I'd never been there, of course. No one there had ever been there. But I was in Tanzania when they were building the Tanzam Railway, which China was financing. It was really the first Belt and Road type project. And in the dorm I was staying in, was the chief engineer for the project, who was Chinese. So I got to know him. He said, we're not supposed to talk to one another, China, U.S., but he'd actually been to school in the U.S. for a couple of years. He knew something about it. So we would have lunch and dinner periodically, and he told me a bit about China, and I learned a lot. And he was interested in the U.S. because he knew a little bit about the U.S. So Kissinger had a couple of China experts, but I raised my hand. I said, I've had conversations years ago with some Chinese as well. So he said, why don't you write papers? I was his economic advisor. He said, why don't you write a couple of papers on the Chinese economy? So I did that, not knowing what they were for, but I figured he's a professor, he's interested in China, so write the papers. So wrote them, and then I heard nothing. And then I wake up one morning and I hear on the radio that he had surreptitiously gone to China. The pretext was that he was in Pakistan and he had a stomach ache, and therefore he was out of communication with the press for a couple of days. So then I learned he didn't have a stomach ache at all. He had gone to China, and of course it was news to me, but it was once he got back and we sort of learned that there was then going to be a presidential trip. It really struck me that this was history in the making, and he had done it in such a Kissingerian way, in his own way, using a Pakistani airplane. He went with a couple of people, Winston Lord, John Holdridge, Dick Solomon, who I'd worked with on a fairly regular basis, but it was still a very big surprise. No one knew about it.
Henry Kissinger was born in Germany to a Jewish family that fled Nazi persecution and emigrated to the United States. As a teenager, he worked in a shaving brush factory while excelling in his studies and developing a lifelong passion for history and politics.
How do you think, though, his childhood impacted him, do you think, from a diplomatic standpoint, to have the kind of childhood that he had?
I think that his childhood in Germany was a critical element of his ability to focus on new challenges. I think it was a very challenging childhood. Certainly growing up as a Jew in Germany at that time was challenging. And I think it gave him a sense of persistence and a determination that he was going to be able, that he was going to focus on overcoming obstacles, that he was going to focus on adversity, because he was really doing relatively little. At one point he said to me, if I'd been in Germany, either I'd be dead or I'd be teaching at a high school. And he said neither one of those were, in my judgment, good options. So when he came here, he was always looking for opportunities to improve his lot in life. He was always looking for opportunities. He went to Harvard. He didn't just go to Harvard, but he wrote the longest dissertation ever written for a Harvard PhD. When he got out of Harvard, he was not simply, or when he finished his PhD, he was not simply focused on being a professor, but he wanted to get into and become acquainted with the politics of the country. So he became an advisor to Nelson Rockefeller. There was always a way of taking something that could be, for most people, the end of, or sort of their career trap, in a way, that they would do this for the rest of their lives. He was always thinking, how can I use what I've learned to move myself up to another level and another level and another level. How can I use what I've learned to learn more? It was never about the learning or the dissertation being enough. I mean, he wrote a long dissertation, and it got published, but it was never sufficient. He always had goals that were beyond where he was at the time, mentally and from a career point of view.
And I think everything you just said lays the framework for what happened between U.S.-China relations, because as a lifetime learner, he also kind of learned about the culture, the style, the cadence of the Chinese in order to actually reach a deal, right?
You have put your finger on a key word, and that is, he said, on a regular basis, when we were in the airplane going over to Beijing or wherever we were going, the Middle East too, where we did the Sinai disengagement negotiations, he always said that you need to understand the culture of the country you were dealing with. You needed to understand their culture, and you needed to understand where they were coming from. You needed to know more about their positions than they did. Now, that was a little bit, there was a little humor in that, but it was basically the case that he read about the Chinese culture, the various dynasties in the Middle East. He was not really a Middle East expert, but when we went on these trips, he would read about the history of Saudi Arabia, the history of Jordan, the history of Syria. We went to all these Middle East capitals on a regular basis, and he wanted to be knowledgeable about the history, the culture, the Quran, things of this sort, because he would always inject little vignettes about the culture just to demonstrate that he had studied it and he understood it.
Henry Kissinger's efforts helped reduce China's isolation, paving the way for trade, investment, and eventual economic reforms that fueled its rapid growth.
Talk to me about the development model of China, just the explosion in growth, so many people lifted out of poverty. I mean, just the changes that this action kind of created, in a sense.
For years, they were really making very basic things which did not have a very big market in the U.S. And then Deng Xiaoping came along, and I had the pleasure of talking and meeting with him a lot. He made his visit to southern China. And he really, I think, had a vision for China. He said, China in centuries past was the technological leader of the world. Gunpowder, paper, a whole range of things. China was really the sort of the center of the Asian economies. Americans, you learn about history from Greece westward, Athens, but you don't really have any sense of Asian history. But Asian history is centered on the Middle Kingdom, and we were a very highly technological country at that point. And I had the sense that he was conveying a message that we were able to do that and willing and wanting to do that again. And then the next trip, you'd see one or two quite modern buildings spring up, and then more and more and more. And then don't forget the schools, the universities were closed during the Cultural Revolution. Deng opened the universities. When that happened, there were lots of Chinese who then studied technology, engineering, and then he opened up to allow more and more Chinese to come to the U.S. or Americans to come to China. And a lot of them went to, Caltech, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, places like that, to learn stuff that they weren't able to learn in China because they weren't that far advanced. But they were such good students in the U.S., they picked up a huge amount and brought it back to China. And then that tradition of medical cooperation, which did start with the Rockefeller Hospital, and that was about over 100 years ago. And medical collaboration between Chinese researchers and doctors and American researchers and doctors is a fabulous thing. There's almost no paper written today on a serious medical research project that's not co-written with an American and a Chinese doctor or researcher. So there's this evolved very quickly, almost to the point where when you'd go there and then you'd go there 6 months later, it looked like a different China.
Henry Kissinger consistently argued for diplomatic and economic engagement with China, believing that cooperation was in the best interest of both nations. As you know, Kissinger is seen as an old friend of China, and it's a lengthy relationship that dated up, as you mentioned, he visited even when he was 100. What do you think are some of the diplomatic strategies that he put in place that still exist today, and what's his legacy, would you say?
I think his legacy was, first of all, he had a very clear view that any demonstration of weakness is going to lead countries who are your adversaries to think you're going to be even weaker. If you make a concession here or there, ultimately you had to make some compromise, for sure. He knew that. He knew compromise was not a dirty word. But if you did it prematurely or you did it in a non-thoughtful way, you would just convince other countries that they could get more out of you. So he was very careful in how he made concessions or how he developed compromises. And he, I think, always understood that if you're going to have effective diplomacy, you have to have a strong military capability. You had to have a strong military deterrent capacity in order to be a credible negotiator. And deterrence, from his point of view, was extremely important. If a country thought it could take advantage of you, that you weren't fully prepared from a military point of view, then it would. And I always felt that he sort of understood that link between deterrence and the ability to convince the other guy, A, that you had the military strength to counter what they were planning to do, but you also had the will. And having weapons without the will to use them was going to also lead to their view that your deterrence was sort of feckless or insufficient or inadequate, or that you just didn't have the internal strength. And one of the things he was always worried about, this goes to Vietnam, was that if a country sees us as divided internally, whoever it was, in that case it was the Soviet Union, but it can apply anywhere, that if he sees the U.S. as divided and irresolute and without a strong common sense of its own interests, then other countries would take advantage of those internal divisions. In the end, if other countries see that you're able internally to pull your political system together and to pull your leaders together around a common thread internally, it gave a signal that you're able to do that externally. Whereas if you're divided internally, you're going to be seen as somewhat divided or irresolute or unable to act externally. So,
well, this has been great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
For more on this episode, go to america.cgtn.com/fullframe.
That's this edition of Full Frame. Our thanks to Winston Lord and Robert Hormats for their perspectives on the legacy of Henry Kissinger. If you know other visionaries you'd like to see on our program, email us at fullframe@cgtnamerica.com. And from all of us on Full Frame, thanks so much for watching.